In the 3 weeks since the return to the White House, U.S. President Donald Trump has signed dozens of executive orders aimed at rescinding the work done by the Biden administration. This has received criticism from his country and globally. Senior research fellow at the Center for Advancement of Scholarship, Professor Daniel Bradlow, joins us now to chat a little bit more about this. Professor, thank you so much for joining us and a very good morning to you. These 3 weeks, to many around the world, may seem like almost 3 years because so much has happened. What do you make of the daily occurrences, as it seems to be at this point, and the changes that the Trump administration is trying to make?
Good morning, Masa, and good morning to the viewers. As you say, it's been a tumultuous 3 weeks. He's done an enormous amount, probably more than most people thought. He's upended the international trade regime, threatening to impose tariffs on a broad range of different countries, in practically every country in the world, including South Africa. He's withdrawn from a number of international organizations and has initiated a review of U.S. participation in the UN, as well as in the World Bank and the IMF. He's doing many things domestically as well. As we know, in South Africa, he's shut down USAID and the PEPFAR program, which are causing all sorts of complications. I think in some ways, to try and make sense of this, you have to think of it as he's trying to reassert control by the US over the global economy, feeling that and the global system generally, feeling that under the Biden administration and before that, US authority had been diminished and it had lost out in global affairs.
And Prof, in trying to assert America's dominance in global affairs again, is this, taking a look at history as well, I think that's what he's probably romanticizing, the days of the forefathers of America as well, and the pre-presidents too, and the former presidents too. But we are in a different era now. As we saw when he did go and hit out with all those tariffs as well, I don't think that President Trump expected the kind of a backlash that he's been receiving from around the world. And with that backlash, Prof, do you think it'll deter a man like Donald Trump?
It's certainly not yet. I mean, in many ways, he must be feeling somewhat vindicated. He tried to pressure Mexico and Canada, for example, and they both seem to back down. I think it's questionable whether you should interpret it that way, but it's certainly they succumbed to his attempts to stop migrants coming into the US from those countries. He's bullied Panama. He's threatened all sorts of things. And so far, it looks like he could be winning. I don't think that's the correct interpretation, but it can look that way. I think, on the other hand, it's important to keep in mind, the US is still a very powerful country. It has a very powerful military. Its economy accounts for something like 20% of the global GDP. And the US dollar is obviously the center of the global financial system. But in relative terms, it's not as powerful as it used to be. It's losing power in relative terms to China, to India, to the rising powers around the world. And I think Trump has not fully taken that into account. And at some point, there will be a backlash that will expose the limits of how much power the US still has.
And sometimes that backlash, Prof, we can see happening internally as well, as we've seen the federal judge pausing Trump's freeze on foreign aid just a few hours ago as well. So there is some sort of aspects where it looks like he may be winning in his project. And there are other aspects where there is a pushback, not only by the countries that you've mentioned as well, but of course, like I'm mentioning, the judiciary within the United States itself, but also when we're looking at our partners in the EU who've asserted their confidence in South Africa and trade relations with this region as well, almost to say that, if you want to go on your own and alienate your allies like the EU, as we've seen Donald Trump do, they will look elsewhere. And one day, do we then expect the US to find itself kind of isolated due to these kinds of decisions that are being made?
It's very hard to understand why you want to antagonize all your closest friends. Yeah. As you said, in the EU, Canada, Mexico, But that seems to be what he's trying to do at the moment. I think for a country like South Africa, on the other hand, we have to think, how do we react to this? We can't be driven by the Trump agenda. We have to think about where do we find allies? There are many countries that are in a similar position, feeling very nervous about what's happening. And so it's an opportunity for those countries to explore, do they have some common interests that they could work on together now? I think there's civil society groups around the world that are also potential allies. And there's, particularly for us, because we're the chair of the G20 this year, there's a forum where we can explore these issues, where the US is likely to seem somewhat isolated if it continues in the way that it is, and to look at, are there ways to form alliances with some of the other countries in the G20, in the BRICS, in other areas, in the African Union, and to see, are there ways we can use this time to try and gain some room for maneuver.
Yeah, not only will the US be isolated in this year's G20, but also they will be absent. They've made that pretty clear, that they will not attend it here in South Africa. Prof, just going to your point to say it is quite bizarre to alienate yourself from your closest allies and friends. I'd also want to add to that while we're seeing the US President Donald Trump alienating himself from the country's closest allies, we also see him somewhat changing his tone and almost, one could say, cozying up to the likes of Vladimir Putin of Russia. He spoke gloriously this week about a phone call that was over an hour long with Russia, and he's seemingly having a change of tune in terms of what is going on between Russia and Ukraine.
Yes, I mean, that's not so surprising because Trump has spoken positively about President Putin for many years, from beginning in his first term as president. And so it's not so surprising he's reaching out now. I think it's important to remember that countries, as the cliche has it, has permanent interests, but not permanent friends and permanent enemies. And President Trump is sending a message that the US is reassessing its priorities in the world. Does it want to be so connected to Europe, or is it shifting towards other areas of the world? And so there is some changes which are not unique to President Trump. Some of them started really going back to President Obama with his shift to Asia. And so some of this is just the US is reassessing its position in the world, partly because it's losing power and there's rising influence and power in Asia that it has to take into account. It says, and what you can debate this, that Europe has relied too heavily on American defense support, and that must end. And he's making that clear. And some of the European leaders are saying something similar. Question for us is, where does Africa fit into this? I mean, we have some of the critical minerals that the world needs, but they're not necessarily uniquely in Africa. They could be found elsewhere. So it's a moment where we have to think, as Africans, how do we fit into a changing global environment?
As South Africa, we've made our allegiance with the likes of Israel, a very big ally of the United States, quite clear. We've made our allegiance as well with BRICS, for instance. We're part of BRICS, part of the founding members of BRICS. And that is not something that the US also takes kindly to. They also warned, as soon as he came into power again, that should you even think of establishing a BRICS currency, that, there will be some sort of repercussions. We did see Elon Musk, who's a big right-hand man of President Donald Trump, meeting with the Indian Prime Minister, and that seemed to go very well. Do you think there could be a sort of a divide and conquer amongst the BRICS nations as well? Because it seems like they are forming quite a formidable force and having more countries joining as well. And that could pose a threat to the US, because they don't want other countries rallying together outside of them and the US dollar.
I mean, I think it's an important question. The BRICS, it's clearly a growing organization. As you point out, there are more members coming into the BRICS, but the common interests of the different countries in the BRICS are not all that clear. At a very broad level, there's agreement that the current international arrangements don't work for the benefit of countries in the global south, or in the BRICS more specifically. But exactly what should be done about that is not clear. So, for example, Russia and China both have a permanent veto in the UN Security Council, and they don't necessarily want reform of the Security Council that would benefit countries like India or Brazil. So there are precedents of where countries, particularly in developing countries, have agreed at a very general level on changes that they would like to see. And then when the specifics start becoming important, that agreement falls apart and the rich countries are able to exploit that to block change. That's a real vulnerability in the BRICS at the moment. Is what exactly are the specific interests where agreements can be reached and there's sufficient agreement that we can hold together a coalition long enough to force that sort of change. And that's where I think we have to look beyond the BRICS to some of the other middle powers, to countries that are not interested in joining the BRICS, but share an interest with us in having reforms in the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, in systems like that. And some of them might be countries in the global north as well. And some of them might be not only countries, but non-state actors like civil society groups, business groups, religious groups that could also play an important role in those coalitions.